The spring deluge swept across the Dakota Territory like divine retribution, transforming the parched earth around Broken Wheel into a quagmire that swallowed wagon wheels whole. In this land, where the Transcontinental Railroad had arrived only 3 years prior, bringing with it a peculiar mixture of progress and perdition, and the storm seemed to wash away the thin veneer of civilization that clung to frontier settlements like morning frost. In a trapper's abandoned cabin, where oil lamplight flickered against rain-battered windows, Yiska opened his eyes to find a woman's hands pressed against the bullet furrow carved across his left shoulder. The pain brought with it the memory of his grandfather's teaching. "Grandson, when the white man's bullets find Cheyenne flesh, it is either Maheo's warning or his calling home. Listen carefully to know which." She knelt beside him on buffalo robes, her torn traveling dress plastered to her frame like wet bark. Dark hair hung in sodden ropes around a face streaked with mud, and something darker, his blood mixed with her own from a split lip. Her green eyes held steady despite the tremor in her fingers as she worked to stem the bleeding with strips torn from her petticoat. "Don't move," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hammering rain. "They're circling like wolves." Hoofbeats splashed through standing water outside the riders, taking their time now that they had cornered their prey. A shotgun barrel scraped against the door's rough planking, testing for weakness, while shadows moved past the single window like death incarnate hunting the living. Yiska's ceremonial war bonnet lay nearby, its sacred eagle feathers darkened with rainwater and gore, each feather earned through acts of courage recognized by the Council of 44, the governing body of all Cheyenne bands. The largest feather, tipped with red ochre, had been given to him by his grandfather, White Thunder, after the battle at Beecher Island, where about 50 of Forsyth's scouts held out for days against hundreds of Cheyenne and Lakota near Beecher Island. These were not mere decorations, but sacred reminders of obligations that stretched beyond this moment to his people, and the delicate peace he worked to preserve between two worlds that understood each other poorly. "Who are you?" he asked in English, though his accent carried the measured cadence of someone for whom it remained a carefully learned tongue, each word shaped with the same precision he applied to fletching arrows. "Lavinia Reed," she answered without breaking concentration as she bound the wound. "And you saved my life tonight, though I'm beginning to wonder if either of us will live to see morning." The shotgun barrel tapped twice against the door with funeral precision. Lightning sliced the sky, illuminating 3 mounted figures positioned around the cabin with military discipline. These were not common bandits, but professionals who understood their deadly craft and the kind of men the railroad companies hired to clear obstacles from their expanding empire, whether those obstacles wore war paint or carried surveyor's tools. "Can you ride?" She pressed her palm, checking his chest for signs of shock. "Can you kill a man?" He countered, studying her face for the answer that would determine their chances of survival. Something shifted in her expression, a hardening that transformed her from frightened girl to someone who had learned that frontier mercy was a luxury the weak could not afford. In Dakota Territory, where the Homestead Act had brought thousands of hopeful farmers to land that could barely support prairie grass, survival demanded compromises that Eastern sensibilities would never understand. We're about to find out together. 6 months earlier, Maximilian Voss had stepped off the eastbound train in Broken Wheel with the calculating satisfaction of a man whose long-term investments were finally yielding dividends. The Dakota Southern Railroad had reached this particular bend in Crow Creek only 2 years prior, but already Voss could see the transformation that iron rails brought to every frontier settlement. Frame buildings replacing sod houses, telegraph lines carrying eastern capital westward, and most importantly, territorial law enforcement stretched thin enough to create opportunities for men who understood how to exploit legal gaps. He was not physically imposing medium height, soft hands manicured in the Eastern fashion, a beard trimmed to suggest respectability. But he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had never learned to doubt his own importance. His traveling companions included a secretary, a bodyguard, and enough luggage to suggest permanent residence rather than mere business venture. What the townspeople didn't understand was that Voss's empire rested on a foundation of fraud so systematic it would have impressed the most corrupt political machines of New York or Chicago. For 3 years operating out of mining claims scattered across 3 territories, he had been filing false death certificates for miners supposedly killed in cave-ins and explosions. The scheme required precision collecting insurance payments, while the deceased continued working under assumed names for drastically reduced wages, their families believing them dead, while they labored in conditions that made death seem preferable to continued existence. The beauty of the system lay in its exploitation of frontier record-keeping. In territories where circuit judges appeared twice yearly, and territorial marshals covered areas larger than most eastern states, documentation was often incomplete, witnesses scarce, and verification nearly impossible. A man could die on paper in Montana and be reborn under a new name in Dakota, with minimal risk of discovery. When Lavinia Reed arrived on a freight wagon that October, stepping down onto Broken Wheel's single muddy street with a carpet bag and the hollow-eyed look of recent widowhood, she represented the final piece Voss needed to perfect his operation. She was exactly what he required. A young woman with no family connections, no official documentation beyond a worn marriage certificate, and desperate circumstances that made her willing to accept employment without asking uncomfortable questions. What Voss could not have anticipated was that Lavinia possessed literacy and curiosity, 2 qualities that made her dangerous to criminal enterprises. Unlike most frontier women who had learned to read just enough to manage household accounts and write brief letters to distant family, she could read and write fluently in a fine, educated hand. Her deceased Quaker husband had taught school before consumption claimed his life in Ohio, and during their brief marriage, he had shared with her not just books, but the analytical thinking that came from years of classroom instruction. Voss had researched her background thoroughly before orchestrating her husband's accidental death, a wagon overturning on an icy road outside Toledo that left no witnesses and cleared the way for his long-term plans. James Reed had been a minor obstacle, a man whose integrity and protective instincts would have interfered with Voss's manipulation of his widow. The businessman had been watching them both for months, learning their habits, their financial vulnerabilities, their desperate need for security that would make Lavinia compliant when the time came. The territorial economy of 1874 made such schemes possible. Dakota's population had swollen from 8,000 to over 40,000 in just 5 years, driven by railroad expansion and wildly optimistic reports of agricultural potential. Most homesteaders arrived with minimal capital and maximum hope, only to discover that the same weather patterns that had created the territory's vast grasslands could destroy a wheat crop in a single afternoon. Failed farmers became miners, loggers, railroad workers, anything that promised wages sufficient to feed families through another brutal winter. Working in Voss's compound, a cluster of frame buildings that served as both mining office and residential quarters, Lavinia began noticing patterns that troubled her increasingly educated eye. The company employed an unusually large number of men who seemed to have no histories, no families, no connections to communities beyond the mining camp itself. More troubling miners reported dead in accidents would reappear weeks later under different names, drawing wages for work they had supposedly died performing. Her notebook became both record and insurance policy, documenting names matched to fraudulent death certificates, dates when supposedly deceased miners received new work assignments under false identities, and most damning of all, insurance payment records that showed the same claims being filed in multiple territories for the same fabricated accidents. Meanwhile, Yiska navigated his own precarious relationship with the changing frontier. At 30 winters, he served as war leader for his band of northern Cheyenne, son of Peace Chief Running Elk, who had signed the Fort Laramie treaties when Bluecoats promised security in exchange for boundaries that seemed to shift with political convenience. The Medicine Lodge Treaty of 1867 had assigned his people to reservations in Indian Territory, but many bands had refused to relocate, choosing instead the dangerous path of resistance that kept them in their traditional hunting grounds. The treaties had cost his people dearly. 2 of his younger brothers had died in the Sand Creek Massacre 12 years earlier, victims of Colorado volunteers who claimed to be enforcing peace while practicing genocide against sleeping villages. His father's faith in white promises remained unshaken. The old chief still believed that honorable behavior could coexist with political realism. But Yiska had learned to trust actions over words, results over rhetoric. Each month, Yiska rode to Fort Laramie, not just to trade, but to maintain the delicate balance that kept his band safe from military intervention. The post commander, Colonel William Hayes, was a career soldier who understood that peaceful Cheyenne were preferable to hostile ones. But Hayes answered to territorial authorities who saw all Indians as obstacles to progress. The monthly meetings allowed both men to measure the other's intentions, to exchange information that might prevent the kind of misunderstandings that led to massacres. The cultural complexity of these negotiations would have been incomprehensible to most white settlers. Yiska moved between worlds not just linguistically, but spiritually, carrying responsibilities to Cheyenne traditions that were thousands of years old, while adapting to political realities that changed with each election in Washington. The eagle feathers in his war bonnet were not symbols, but sacred objects, each one blessed by medicine men who had fasted and prayed before bestowing recognition for specific acts of courage. To wear them in dealings with white authorities was both an assertion of identity and a reminder that some honors could not be bought, sold, or surrendered. On the night that changed everything, he had been returning from Fort Laramie, where he'd traded 4 Mustang Colts animals he had captured and trained himself for ammunition and blankets his people needed for winter. The ammunition was for hunting, though everyone understood it might be needed for other purposes if the delicate peace collapsed. The blankets were Hudson Bay wool, expensive, but necessary in a land where winter temperatures could kill within hours. The trail home led past the stage road, and there he encountered the overturned coach and 3 men systematically looting its contents. The Dakota stage line had been operating for less than 2 years, carrying mail passengers and occasionally payrolls between settlements scattered across hundreds of miles of territory. Attacks were common enough that most passengers traveled armed, but this particular assault had succeeded through surprise and professional execution. Lavinia fought like a cornered wildcat against the gang's leader, a snake-thin man called Rattler Pike, while his companion stuffed official documents into saddlebags. She had managed to keep possession of a small leather notebook she clutched against her chest, with desperate determination, her torn dress and bleeding lip evidence of the struggle that had preceded Yiska's arrival. When Pike raised his Colt Navy toward Lavinia's head, Yiska made his choice. His Spencer carbine spoke once from 300 yards, the heavy .52 caliber bullet taking Pike's hat and most of his left ear. The second shot scattered horses, while Yiska charged down the slope rawhide lariat, spinning overhead, in a technique learned from Comanche warriors his grandfather had fought alongside decades earlier. Pike wounded Yiska with a grazing shot before disappearing into the growing storm. But immediate danger had passed. The driver was beyond help, another casualty of territorial violence that would be recorded in territorial reports as death by misadventure, if it was recorded at all. But Lavinia was alive and coherent despite her ordeal, and something in her eyes suggested she would not be easily broken by what she had experienced. The door exploded inward with splintering violence that shook the cabin's foundations. Rattler Pike burst through first, his Colt navy blazing in confined space, followed by the stocky gunman called Freddy, and a third man, whose professional calm marked him as one of the railroad's hired specialists. Muzzle flashes strobed like lightning as bullets chewed through log walls and furniture with devastating efficiency. Yiska rolled sideways off buffalo robes, pulling Lavinia down as they sought cover behind the heavy oak table. The thick wood absorbed impacts with sounds like axes biting trees, but protection wouldn't hold indefinitely against concentrated fire from 3 weapons. "Where's the book, witch?" Pike snarled his nasal voice, cutting through gunfire with the authority of someone accustomed to compliance through intimidation. "Go straight to blazes." Lavinia shouted back, and Yiska felt fierce admiration for her courage, even as lead whined overhead. He used his war bonnet as decoy, lifting it on his Spencer's barrel and moving it slowly past the table's edge. Pike's gun roared twice, eagle feathers scattering as bullets found their mark. But the ruse served its purpose by drawing enemy fire away from their actual position. In that instant of misdirected attention, Yiska launched himself across the cabin floor in a rolling dive that brought him within arm's reach of Pike. They crashed together against the wall, fighting for control of the outlaw's weapon, while their bodies slammed into rough surfaces that drew blood from exposed skin. At close quarters, Yiska's experience in hand-to-hand combat gave him advantages that firearms could not match. Freddy pivoted toward the struggle, raising his pistol, but Lavinia had anticipated the move. She struck with Yiska's knife, opening a red line across the gunman's forearm that sent his shot wild into the ceiling. He backhanded her with enough force to split her lip and spin her against the stone fireplace, but the blow had cost him his concentration. Yiska saw her fall and felt something cold and implacable rise in his chest, not mere anger, but the focused, killing rage that had made his people formidable warriors for generations. He grabbed a 3-legged stool and brought it down on Freddy's skull like a war club, the impact producing a sound like splitting melons. The third gunman had been wounded in the crossfire, but remained dangerous. As Yiska struggled with Pike, the wounded man drew a backup weapon and took careful aim at Lavinia's unprotected back. His shot never came. She had found Yiska's tomahawk among his gear and buried it in the gunman's chest, with enough force to penetrate ribs and reach his heart. Pike, seeing his companions down, made one desperate attempt to complete his mission. He released Yiska's gun hand and lunged for the notebook with reaching fingers. But Yiska caught him around the throat with a grip that could crush windpipes. They fell together, Pike's face purpling as oxygen stopped reaching his brain, his struggles growing weaker until consciousness fled entirely. They ran through rain that struck like handfuls of gravel thrown by angry spirits, heading for cottonwoods marking the dry river's course. Behind them, the cabin blazed with flames that would consume all evidence of what had transpired there. Another mysterious fire in a territory where such incidents were blamed on lightning, hostile Indians, or simple misfortune. The normally placid dry river had become a brown torrent 40 yards wide, carrying mountain debris and running too deep for safe crossing. Spring runoff combined with the storm had transformed it into a raging beast that could sweep away horses and riders with equal indifference. They took shelter under the railroad trestle, while pursuers' voices carried through rain-soaked darkness. The massive timber structure represented everything that was changing in Dakota Territory, Eastern Capital, transforming Western wilderness technology, conquering geography, progress, demanding its price in blood and displacement. Yiska tied his rawhide lariat around Lavinia's waist with practiced efficiency, the rope braided from buffalo hide by his grandmother, using techniques passed down through generations of Cheyenne women. Together, they plunged into the flood-fighting current that tried to sweep them downstream toward rocks that could crack skulls or break bones. Halfway across, with brown water surging around their chests, Yiska's foot caught something heavy beneath the surface. A dead steer bloated with gas and tangled in fence wire had wedged against a boulder. The wire wrapped around his leg as current shifted the carcass, suddenly dragging him under with deadly efficiency. Lavinia dove into Flood, with his knife clenched in her fist, her pale face disappearing beneath churning water as she fought to reach him. Current tumbled them along rocky bottom until she found wire wrapped around his leg and slashed through it with desperate strength. Together, they fought back to surface, gasping and choking on water that tasted of mud and death. They reached the far shore as false dawn grayed the eastern sky, soaked and exhausted, but alive. The notebook wrapped in oiled cloth inside her bodice had survived intact, along with secrets that had already cost lives and would claim others before truth was revealed. Deputy U.S. Marshal Leander Shaw stood on the boardwalk outside his office in Broken Wheel, a tall man with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing of importance while ignoring details that didn't matter. Appointed by territorial government to maintain order across 300 square miles of frontier, Shaw believed in law over violence, procedure over expedience, and the radical notion that justice should be colorblind beliefs that had cost him advancement opportunities in territories where pragmatism usually trumped principle. His badge carried federal authority, but that authority meant little without the power to enforce it. Shaw commanded no troops employed, no deputies, and answered to political appointees who measured success by railroad mile markers and mining production reports rather than justice served or lives saved. In practical terms, he was one man with a gun and a book of territorial statutes trying to impose order on a land that had known only the law of survival for centuries. "Morning, Yiska," Shaw said carefully, hand resting near his service revolver. "Looks like you've had trouble." The caution in Shaw's manner wasn't fear of Yiska personally, but awareness that any incident involving Indians could escalate beyond his ability to control. Territorial authorities lived in constant fear of another Indian war, not from concern for lives that might be lost, but from understanding that warfare meant federal intervention, military expenditures, and political consequences that could end careers. Rattler Pike and 2 others hit the westbound stage. Yiska replied, helping Lavinia up boardwalk steps. "Driver's dead. They were after federal mail." Lavinia stepped forward, producing the notebook with hands that trembled only slightly, despite everything she had endured. They wanted this. Records from Voss Mining that don't match company reports filed with territorial authorities. Shaw's expression sharpened as he recognized implications that extended far beyond simple robbery. Mail theft was a federal offense, but fraud involving territorial contracts could bring scrutiny from Washington that local authorities preferred to avoid. Dar. Isidore Klein emerged from his office, a thin man in his 50s who had brought modern medical practices to a frontier that often preferred whiskey and prayer. His surgical instruments had been sterilized with carbolic acid before each use, a practice considered eccentric by patients who believed that if God intended them to survive, cleanliness was irrelevant. They gathered in Klein's surgery, where shelves of medical supplies and carefully organized instruments spoke of someone who believed knowledge and precision were humanity's best weapons against disease and death. Klein had studied at Harvard Medical College before coming west, driven by idealism that had survived contact with frontier realities better than most such impulses. As Klein worked with practiced efficiency, Hilda Price arrived with fresh clothes for Lavinia and hot coffee for everyone. A woman in her 40s who had come west to teach school and stayed to become the community's moral center, Hilda possessed the kind of unshakable integrity that made corruption difficult and cowardice impossible in her presence. "Marshal Shaw," she said, setting down her basket. "I've been hearing troubling stories about Voss Mining's employment practices. Boys who were supposedly killed in accidents, then seen alive weeks later using different names." She examined the notebook with scholarly intensity, her teacher's training allowing her to recognize patterns that less educated observers might miss. "I taught some of these boys to write," she said quietly. Tommy Morris enlisted as killed last month. But his mother received a letter just last week saying he'd found work in the new tunnel under the name Tom Morris. Shaw's face had gone grim during this exchange, understanding beginning to replace confusion as the scope of Voss's scheme became clear. If accurate, we're looking at massive fraud. Insurance money for fake deaths, federal contracts based on false labor reports, territorial taxes avoided through non-existent casualties. Klein's face had gone pale during this exchange, guilt written clearly in his expression. "Marshal, there's something about those death certificates." His voice carried weight of guilty knowledge. Sometimes a man needs to die on paper, so his family can survive in reality. Shaw's attention focused intensely, meaning what exactly Dr. Klein set down his instrument's hands, trembling with more than professional concern. "Meaning I've signed certificates for men who aren't dead. Fathers with children, starving workers crushed by debt they can never repay legally. When Voss offered them new identities." He trailed off, unable to meet their eyes. The silence that followed was broken by Shaw's careful voice. "Dr. Klein, are you confessing to participation in a criminal conspiracy?" "I'm confessing to trying to keep families from starving," Klein replied with quiet dignity. "In a territory where crop failures can kill as surely as bullets, sometimes legal technicalities matter less than human survival." Before Shaw could respond, further hoofbeats echoed from the street. Through windows, they could see Pike and companions riding into town, with several unrecognized men professionals with hard faces and the careful movements of hired killers. The kind of men who appeared when situations required solutions that couldn't be achieved through legal channels. Pike called across the street with authority of someone accustomed to obedience. "Marshal Shaw, I'm here about theft and abduction. That Indian stole property belonging to Maximilian Voss, and he's holding a white woman against her will." Shaw stepped onto the boardwalk, his badge catching morning sunlight, along with something harder in his expression. "Mr. Pike, I'll need to see documentation supporting those claims." But Hilda Price had anticipated this gambit emerging from the general store with her own paper. "That's not the agreement I witnessed," she announced loudly enough for gathering townspeople to hear. "Miss Reed's employment contract was for laundry and kitchen duties, only with weekly wages and termination rights clearly specified." The confrontation ended with Pike retreating, but not before making threats that left everyone understanding this was far from over. In territories where law enforcement was sporadic and federal authority, distant threats carried weight proportional to the resources backing them. That afternoon, Sarah Morrison approached Hilda Price's schoolhouse, a woman whose premature aging spoke of frontier hardships that had claimed her husband's health and her family's security. She carried herself with the careful dignity of someone who had learned that pride was sometimes all that stood between survival and surrender. "Miss Price?" She began hesitantly, glancing around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "There's something about my Tommy that maybe you should know." Hilda set down her lesson plans, recognizing the look of someone carrying a burden too heavy for individual shoulders. "Please sit down. Tell me what's troubling you." "It's about the accident at Voss's mine." Sarah continued, her voice barely audible. "The one where Tommy supposedly died. The thing is, Tommy's not dead. He's working in the deep tunnels under a different name, sending me money every month, but scared to death someone will find out." She produced a worn letter from her apron pocket. "He writes that he can't come home, can't ever use his real name again, because if anyone discovers the truth, Voss will have him killed for real. My boy is living like a ghost, and I don't know what to do about it." Hilda studied the letter, her teacher's eye recognizing the handwriting she had helped develop years earlier. "Sarah, This is evidence of serious crimes. If Voss is forcing men to live under false identities. That's just it, Sarah interrupted. Tommy wasn't forced. When the mine accident happened, a real accident that killed 3 men, Tommy was supposed to be in that tunnel. But he'd traded shifts with Jake Sullivan because Jake needed the extra pay for his sick wife. Tommy felt guilty about surviving when Jake died and when Voss offered him a way to start over with a clean name and no debts. The implication struck Hilda with sudden clarity. Voss isn't just creating fake deaths. He's exploiting real tragedies using survivors' guilt and economic desperation to create a workforce he can control completely. My boy is trapped. Sarah whispered, tears finally coming. He can't come home because he's supposed to be dead. He can't leave because Voss holds papers that could hang him for fraud. And I can't report it because that would destroy the only income keeping us alive. Hilda took the woman's hands, her decision forming with the certainty that comes from moral clarity. Sarah, there are people in town right now who can help. But we'll need to be very brave, all of us, to see this through. Maximilian Voss arrived on the afternoon freight, stepping from his private rail car with measured dignity of someone accustomed to deference. His meeting with Shaw was conducted in the marshal's office behind closed doors that didn't prevent interested parties from observing the animated gestures and raised voices that marked their discussion. When Voss emerged, his face was dark with frustrated anger, but his voice remained controlled as he addressed the small crowd that had gathered. Citizens of Broken Wheel, I fear you've been misled by individuals with questionable motives. The safety and prosperity of your community depend on maintaining proper relationships with established business enterprises. His words carried the subtle threat of economic consequences. Lost jobs, reduced investment, the kind of pressure that could strangle frontier communities dependent on single industries. But Shaw's response was equally measured and far more direct. Mr. Voss, territorial law prohibits intimidation of witnesses in criminal investigations. I trust you'll conduct yourself accordingly during your stay in Broken Wheel. Robert Hale entered Shaw's office after Voss's departure, his weathered face creased with worry that went beyond normal frontier concerns. A homesteader trying to scratch living from marginal land, like many small farmers, he owed money to various business interests and understood how economic leverage could be applied against those who couldn't pay. Marshal. Hale began hesitantly. There's something I might know about, though it shames me to admit participation. He twisted his hat nervously, the gesture of a man who had learned that honesty could be expensive, but that deception carried its own costs. Last month, Voss asked me to witness some papers. Said it was routine business documentation needed legal signatures for territorial filing requirements. What was it? Lavinia asked, though her expression suggested she suspected something ominous. Marriage license, Hale admitted miserably. Made out for Maximilian Voss and Lavinia Reed, dated 6 months ago when you first came to town. Voss said it was standard procedure for employing single women protective documentation to prevent gossip or legal complications. The silence that followed was broken only by Yiska's chair scraping, as he stood abruptly, his face showing the kind of controlled anger that preceded violence. Under territorial law, married women's property became husbands' absolute possession, including documents or evidence. More ominously, wives' testimony could be restricted in cases involving husbands' business interests. That document creates legal complications, Shaw said carefully. If filed with territorial authorities, it could affect Miss Reed's ability to testify against Voss or control evidence in her possession. But as they discussed this development, Klein had been growing increasingly agitated, his professional composure cracking under the weight of accumulated guilt and fear. There's something else about that marriage license, he said, voice haunted by knowledge he'd carried too long alone. Voss came to me 3 weeks ago, asking about death certificates. Not just the fraudulent ones, he wanted to know about a specific death I'd recorded 7 months ago. A man named James Reed, listed as accidental drowning when his wagon overturned crossing Icy Creek outside Toledo, Ohio. Lavinia's face went white as comprehension struck with the force of physical blow. James was my husband. I know, Klein said quietly. I didn't sign that certificate. It came from Ohio state authorities, but Voss knew details about that accident that weren't in my reports or any official documentation. Details only someone who was there could know. The implication hit Lavinia like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs and replacing it with rage so pure it left her shaking. He killed James, she whispered, and then louder, her voice rising with fury that had been building for months. That monster killed my husband. He murdered James to clear the way for his sick scheme. Her composure finally cracked, months of suppressed grief and anger pouring out in explosive rage. James never hurt anyone in his life. He was the gentlest man I ever knew, dedicated to teaching children and helping his neighbors, and that animal killed him, just to make me vulnerable enough to control. Shaw's hand moved to his weapon as he recognized the look of someone pushed beyond endurance. But Yiska was already beside her, his presence offering strength without constraint, support without judgment. We'll make him pay, Yiska said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of certainty that came from cultural traditions where justice was personal rather than institutional. All of them. Every man who participated, every man who profited, every man who knew and did nothing. The ride to Spanish Wells took them across 50 miles of broken country through terrain that told the story of Dakota Territory's violent transformation. They passed homestead cabins abandoned when crops failed their broken windows, staring blindly across fields where wheat had been planted with hope and harvested with despair. They rode through valleys where Sioux hunting parties had camped for generations, now empty except for cattle that belonged to ranchers who had never seen the land they claimed. Yiska proved to be a careful guide, choosing routes that avoided main trails while keeping them oriented toward their destination. During rest stops, he shared knowledge that revealed the depth of his connection to the land, which plants could provide emergency food, how to read weather signs in cloud formations, where to find water in country that appeared uniformly dry. Your grandfather, Lavinia asked during one such stop. Was he a chief? Medicine man? Yiska replied, his fingers absently checking the fletching on his arrows. White Thunder was his name. He taught me that all things are connected: the earth, the sky, the four-legged and two-legged creatures. When white men came, he said they saw only pieces, not the whole. That's why they could destroy so easily what they didn't understand. She watched him work, noting the precision and care he brought to even routine tasks. What would he think of me, a white woman carrying evidence against other white people? Yiska considered the question seriously, as he did all matters touching on his grandfather's wisdom. He would say that truth has no color, only strength or weakness. You carry strong truth, so you are a strong person regardless of skin or birth. The simple acceptance in his words meant more to her than elaborate declarations might have. In a territory where racial tensions ran deeper than mine shafts and proved far more dangerous, such acceptance was a gift that couldn't be purchased or demanded. They found Niccolo De Luca in the cantina at Spanish Wells, a nervous man who jumped at shadows and kept a leather satchel close to his chair. The settlement itself was typical of mining boomtowns, hastily constructed buildings, a population that changed with each season's prospects, and the kind of casual violence that erupted when men with nothing to lose encountered opportunities to gain everything. De Luca opened his satchel, withdrawing a portfolio of organized papers that spoke of meticulous record-keeping and systematic documentation. Complete records are in Voss's safe, he admitted reluctantly. but I kept copies of the most damaging material as insurance against exactly this kind of situation. Shaw studied the documents with growing amazement. Insurance payments for men who never died. Federal contracts inflated by reporting non-existent workers. Territorial tax avoidance through fraudulent casualty claims. This doesn't just destroy Voss, it implicates half the territorial government. But before DeLuca could agree to testify, Pike arrived with hired guns and the kind of professional killers who followed railroad construction crews west men who specialized in removing obstacles that couldn't be overcome through legal channels. The cantina erupted in thunder and muzzle flashes, customers diving for cover, while bullets shattered bottles and mirrors with equal precision. In confusion of smoke and falling debris, Shaw put bullet through Pike's gun arm, but not before Pike revealed that the fraudulent marriage license had been filed with territorial authorities in Yankton, giving it legal standing that would complicate any prosecution of Voss. The return journey became running battle across 40 miles of unforgiving terrain, with pursuit continuing through 2 days of careful maneuvering across country that offered little cover and less mercy. They reached Broken Wheel, dusty and blood-stained, but alive, though DeLuca had died in the fighting their star witness beyond any earthly court's reach. On their second night during the return journey, they made camp in a cluster of cottonwoods beside a creek that ran clear despite the region's tendency toward alkali water. Yiska had chosen the spot, carefully providing fresh water concealment and multiple escape routes if pursuit caught up with them. As they sat beside their small fire-sharing jerky and hardtack that constituted frontier trail rations, Lavinia found herself studying the man who had become so important to her survival. In firelight, his face showed the kind of strength that came from facing hardship without complaint, the wisdom that came from understanding one's place in a larger pattern. "The feathers in your war bonnet," she said quietly. "What do they mean?" Yiska looked up from where he was checking his weapons, surprised by the question, but pleased by her interest. "Each feather tells a story. This one," he touched the largest tipped with red ochre, "was given by my grandfather after Beecher Island. About 50 of Forsyth's scouts held out for days against hundreds of Cheyenne and Lakota near Beecher Island. We couldn't defeat them, but we proved they couldn't defeat us either. And this one," she indicated a smaller feather marked with blue beadwork. "That was for bringing back 2 crow horses without killing anyone. My grandfather said sometimes courage means choosing not to fight when fighting would be easier." His dark eyes met hers across the fire. "Like choosing to help a white woman when it would be safer to ride away." The intimacy of the moment surprised them both. They had been through danger together, had trusted each other with their lives, but this was something different, the kind of sharing that happened between people who saw beyond circumstances to the person beneath. "Your husband," Yiska said carefully. "What was he like?" Lavinia was quiet for a long moment, staring into flames that danced with memories she rarely allowed herself to examine. "Gentle. Too gentle for this world, maybe. He believed people were basically good, that education and kindness could overcome any problem. When he died..." She paused, struggling with emotions that had been buried under months of survival. "When he died, I thought that gentleness had died with him, that the world had no place for such faith. But you kept it alive," Yiska observed. "In the way you fought for those miners' families, in the way you risked everything to expose truth. That's not weakness, that's the strongest courage there is." She looked at him, then really looked, seeing not just the warrior who had saved her life, but the man who understood loss and chose hope anyway, who carried traditions that were being destroyed but refused to let them die silently. When she moved closer to him on their shared blanket, It wasn't from cold or fear, but from recognition of something rare and valuable in a world that seemed determined to destroy anything good. When his arms came around her, it was with the reverence of someone who understood that some gifts were too precious to be taken lightly. They didn't make love that night. Both understood that some steps couldn't be taken until certain other matters were resolved. But they held each other through the hours before dawn, two people who had found something worth fighting for beyond mere survival. Deputy Clerk Virgil Sutter arrived the next morning with official-looking document and the nervous manner of someone who suspected he was being used for purposes he didn't fully understand. "Mrs. Voss," he began formally, "I have here writ of marital custody, signed by Territorial Judge Harrison. Your husband has requested immediate return to his protection and care." Shaw examined the document carefully, his legal training allowing him to recognize both its apparent authenticity and subtle irregularities in language and formatting. "Mr. Sutter, this writ requires Miss Reed to abandon current residence and return to conjugal domicile. Are you prepared to enforce such requirements?" Sutter's uncertainty became more pronounced as he realized he was being asked to physically compel a woman to return to a man she clearly feared. "Well, Marshal, I suppose that would depend on the lady's cooperation." But Hilda Price had been comparing signatures her teacher's eye trained to notice discrepancies that might escape casual observation. "Gentlemen, I've seen Judge Harrison's signature on school district documents. This isn't his handwriting." She produced a letter from her reticule bearing the territorial seal and Harrison's genuine signature. The letter forms are completely different, and Harrison always uses his full name rather than initials. This document is fraudulent. Sutter departed uncertain and defeated, buying them precious time, while Voss was forced to develop new strategies for achieving his objectives. Klein stepped forward, voice barely audible. "There's something else you need to understand. Voss has been using death certificates as leverage against me and others in the community, but it goes deeper than professional coercion." However, as Klein spoke, something in his manner had changed a nervous energy Yiska's warrior instincts recognized as deception. Klein's eyes avoided direct contact, and his hands trembled with more than emotional distress. The scent of chemicals clung to his clothes, not the familiar odors of medical practice, but something sharper and more dangerous. But looking into Klein's eyes, Yiska saw not evil, but desperate fear and shame of someone forced into betrayal against every principle he'd sworn to uphold. Klein's voice broke as he finally confessed. "He has my daughter Emma. She's only 8 years old, lives with my sister in Denver. Voss showed me photographs of her walking to school playing in the garden. Said she'd have an accident if I didn't do exactly what he ordered." The revelation hit them with the force of physical blow. Klein's cooperation hadn't been bought with money or professional threats, but with the most powerful leverage possible, a parent's love for his child. "He wants me to poison you." Klein continued, his voice barely a whisper. "Gave me a substance that would look like heart failure, said it would be quick and painless. But I can't. I won't murder innocent people even to save my daughter." Yiska's hand moved to his knife, but Shaw's voice cut through rising tension. "Doctor, are you wearing that chemical substance now?" Klein nodded miserably. "On my clothes, my hands. He said proximity would be enough if you didn't suspect. But I diluted it, changed it to something that would only cause illness, not death." Shaw's expression had gone cold with the kind of controlled anger that preceded official action. "Dr. Klein, you're now a witness to attempted murder and conspiracy. Your testimony could be crucial to prosecution, but first, we need to ensure your daughter's safety." "There's more," Klein whispered. Voss has photographs documentation of other children in other towns. He's used this technique before turning doctors and teachers into unwilling accomplices by threatening what they care about most. The final confrontation erupted 4 days later during thunderstorm that avalanched down from Black Hills like concentrated fury of nature itself. Bolts of lightning sliced across sky above Split Rock Canyon, Dakota Territory, while rain transformed mining roads into torrents of liquid mud that could sweep away horses and riders with equal indifference. Voss had finally abandoned legal maneuvering for direct action, his patience exhausted by setbacks that threatened to expose his entire network of criminal enterprises. Word reached town through sources Shaw maintained among Teamsters and railroad workers that Voss had hired 36 hard cases from Kansas City and beyond professional killers who would eliminate witnesses for money and disappear back into Frontier's anonymous violence. "It ends tonight," Shaw declared, checking weapons as lightning bolts sliced overhead. "We have enough evidence to prove fraud in any honest court, but only if we survive long enough to present it." The plan was necessarily simple, limited by their small numbers and the overwhelming force arrayed against them. Yiska would approach mine from north using terrain knowledge to get close without detection. Shaw and Hale would create diversion at main entrance, while Lavinia attempted reaching mine office, where original ledgers were kept in Voss's personal safe. Hilda Price insisted on participating despite Shaw's objections, pointing out that her knowledge of the community's children made her essential for identifying all of Voss's potential victims. "Marshall, this isn't just about stopping one criminal. It's about protecting every family he's threatened or could threaten in the future." The first phase of assault took place on Railroad Trestle, carrying mining spur across Split Rock Canyon, Dakota Territory, its deepest section. Voss's men had planted multiple dynamite charges, intending to destroy bridge and cut off retreat, while making entire incident look like Indian sabotage, a story that would justify military intervention and permanent resolution of the Indian problem in the territory. Yiska reached Trestle just as demolition team began lighting fuses, their work, hampered by wind-driven rain, threatening to extinguish slow-burning cords before reaching explosive charges. Wooden ties were slippery with moisture, and wind howled through canyon with enough force to knock careless men from narrow walkway into churning waters far below. His Spencer carbine spoke 3 times in rapid succession, heavy bullets echoing off canyon walls as 3 demolition experts tumbled from Trestle into flood below. But others remained working desperately to complete destructive tasks, while fuses burned steadily toward deadly destinations. Yiska sprinted across the rain-slick structure, bullets whining around him like angry wasps seeking targets. A sudden gust of wind caught him off balance, his foot slipping on wet wood, worn smooth by countless passages of ore cars. For one terrifying moment, he teetered on Trestle's edge, arms windmilling as 100-foot drop yawned beneath him, the roar of floodwater mixing with thunder in a symphony of potential destruction. Only a desperate grab at support beams saved him from plummeting into rocky torrent that had already claimed 3 lives that night. The dynamite bundles were positioned beneath Trestle's center span, protected from rain by canvas tarps, but connected to multiple fuses, ensuring successful detonation even if some cords failed. The first fuse was easy to cut his knife, parting the cord cleanly. The second required crawling beneath the trestle, while gunfire from canyon rim sent splinters flying around his head like wooden wasps. But the third fuse presented the greatest challenge. It had been cut shorter than the others, and the flame was already racing toward the explosives when Yiska reached it. Only 1 inch of burning cord remained between fire and destruction that would collapse the bridge and trap everyone on the wrong side of the canyon. He slashed desperately with his knife, but the wet fuse cord resisted cutting the hemp fibers swollen with moisture. The blade slipped on the soaked material, precious milliseconds ticking away, while death approached at the speed of burning powder. With no other option, Yiska grabbed the burning end with his bare hand, crushing it between his fingers to smother the flame. The searing pain shot up his arm like liquid fire, but the fire was extinguished. The explosion that followed was muffled by rain and distance, but the trestles shuddered without collapsing entirely. Yiska had cut enough fuses to prevent total destruction, though his burned hand throbbed with agony, and the bridge would require extensive repairs before trains could cross safely. Meanwhile, in the mine's underground passages, where air was thick with coal dust and oppressive heat made breathing laborious, the second phase was unfolding with deadly precision. That spoke of careful planning and professional execution. Shaw fought a running battle through the passages, his revolver speaking with measured authority, as he engaged targets appearing and vanishing in lamplight, like phantoms born from flame and shadow. But Klein was with him, and as they moved deeper into the tunnels, the doctor's behavior became increasingly erratic, torn between loyalty to his companions and fear for his daughter's safety. "Marshal, wait," Klein said suddenly, grabbing Shaw's arm with trembling fingers. "There's something I must tell you." Shaw turned, and Klein struck with a syringe filled with chloral hydrate, the chemical he'd been ordered to use for assassination, but had modified to incapacitate rather than kill. But at the last moment, Klein's conscience revolted against even this compromise with murder. Instead of injecting the dose into a vein where it would take effect immediately, he aimed for muscle tissue, administering an amount that would incapacitate but not permanently harm. "I'm sorry," Klein whispered as Shaw collapsed consciousness, fleeing despite his struggles to remain alert. "He has my daughter. Said he'd kill her if I didn't. But I can't murder you. This will keep you unconscious but alive." But Klein's betrayal had been observed by one of Voss's gunmen, a cold-eyed professional who emerged from the shadows with pistol trained on the doctor's back. "Voss said you might get cold feet." The man sneered with the contempt that killers reserved for those they considered weak. Guess he was right about that. Klein raised his hands, medical training making him acutely aware of his vulnerability and the precise angles from which bullets could penetrate vital organs. "Please, I did what Voss asked. Shaw is unconscious, no longer a threat to anyone." "Not good enough," the gunman replied, cocking his weapon with mechanical precision. "Dead witnesses tell no tales, and live doctors can change their minds about cooperation." The shot echoed through the tunnel, but it was Klein who remained standing. Shaw, despite the drug coursing through his system and the growing darkness clouding his vision, had managed to draw his backup Derringer and put a bullet through the gunman's heart before losing consciousness completely. Klein knelt beside the fallen marshal, checking his pulse with trembling fingers that had saved more lives than they had endangered. "I'm sorry, Leander. I'm so sorry for what I've done. But I'll make this right, I swear it on my daughter's life." Lavinia had become separated in maze-like tunnels, finding herself alone with precious documents clutched against her chest, while water began seeping into lower tunnels from Voss's floodgate system. The rising water created new urgency as brown liquid rose around her ankles, then calves carrying debris and mining equipment with crushing force that could break bones or pin victims beneath the surface. The tunnel system was more complex than she had imagined, a warren of interconnected passages that seemed designed to confuse and trap intruders rather than facilitate efficient mining operations. Oil lamps flickered in wall niches, casting dancing shadows that made every corner seem populated with enemies waiting in darkness. She could hear voices approaching Voss himself, accompanied by at least 3 gunmen searching passages with systematic thoroughness that spoke of familiarity with the underground layout. Their footsteps echoed off stone walls, growing louder with each passing moment, as they methodically eliminated possible hiding places. Water was rising faster now above her knees and climbing toward waist level with relentless determination. Sharp pieces of mining equipment, broken timber with protruding nails that could puncture flesh, chunks of rock that could crush bones, all swirling in chocolate-brown torrent that reeked of mud and death, and the accumulated waste of industrial extraction. There was nowhere to run in the narrow confines, nowhere to hide that wouldn't eventually be discovered by men who knew these tunnels better than she did. The notebook that had started everything was still with her pages, now damp with perspiration and humidity of underground workings, its leather bindings softened by moisture that threatened to dissolve ink and destroy evidence. When they found her, water had risen to her waist and was climbing steadily toward levels that would make breathing impossible. Voss's face was flushed with triumph and barely controlled rage as he waded through rising flood toward her position, flanked by 3 armed men whose eyes held the flat indifference of professional killers who had learned to see targets rather than people. Well, Voss said, his cultured voice echoing off stone walls with sinister politeness that made threats unnecessary. The elusive Miss Reed, or should I say, Mrs. Voss. After all, we are legally married according to territorial law, whether you acknowledge that fact or not. His manner was different now, with the mask of civilized respectability finally abandoned to reveal the predator beneath. "Give me the notebook," he demanded, extending his hand, with the expectation of immediate compliance that came from years of purchasing obedience through fear and economic pressure. "Give it now, and maybe death comes quick instead of slow, drowning in these tunnels where no one will ever find your body." Lavinia clutched the leather-bound book tighter against her chest, her green eyes blazing with defiance, despite the rising water that now reached her ribcage and continued climbing with mechanical persistence. "You know," she said with deadly calm that surprised her with its steadiness. "I used to wonder what kind of man could kill my husband in cold blood. Now I see the kind who's too much of a coward to face his victims when they can fight back." Her words struck home with precision of well-aimed bullets, and Voss's face contorted with rage that transformed his features into something bestial and primitive. His mask of civilized respectability slipped completely, revealing the monster that had always lurked beneath expensive clothes and educated speech. "Your precious James begged like a dog when I held him under that ice water." He snarled with sadistic pleasure that revealed how much he had enjoyed the murder. "Cried for you right up until his lungs filled, and he drowned like the pathetic weakling he was. Probably wet himself before the end, like most cowards do when they meet real men." The cruel revelation shattered something inside Lavinia, replacing months of controlled grief with volcanic fury that felt like physical fire in her veins. "You bastard! He never hurt anyone in his life. He was gentle and kind, and dedicated to helping others, and you murdered him for nothing more than your own twisted ambition." The water continued to rise, chest-deep now, and carrying increasingly dangerous debris that could kill through impact as easily as drowning. They had perhaps 2 minutes before the flood reached the tunnel's ceiling and drowned everyone trapped in the lower passages, but Voss seemed unconcerned by the rising danger. One of Voss's gunmen raised his weapon, but the shot never came. Yiska materialized behind them like a ghost born from darkness itself, his knife finding the man's kidney before he could turn around. The second gunman managed one wild shot that ricocheted off stone walls before Yiska's Colt put him down with permanent finality. But the third gunman was quicker, getting off a shot that grazed Yiska's already wounded shoulder and sent blood streaming down his arm in crimson rivulets. The bullet's impact spun him around, and he stumbled in the rising water, momentarily vulnerable to counterattack. Voss seized the opportunity, pulling a hidden knife and lunging at Yiska's exposed back with the desperate fury of someone whose carefully constructed empire was collapsing around him. But Lavinia was faster, driving her shoulder into Voss's midsection and sending him crashing into the tunnel wall with enough force to crack his skull against stone. The businessman recovered quickly, desperation lending him strength as he grabbed Lavinia around the throat and pressed his derringer against her temple with shaking hands. "Drop your weapons, Indian, or I paint these walls with her brains." Water was still rising neck-deep now for Lavinia, and she had to tilt her head back to keep her mouth and nose above the murky surface that tasted of industrial waste and death. The current was growing stronger, threatening to sweep them all away into the flooded depths of the mine where bodies would never be recovered. Yiska dropped his gun, raising his hands in apparent surrender, while his warrior training taught him patience and the value of waiting for the right moment. When a piece of broken timber floating in the flood struck Voss in the back, the businessman instinctively turned to look, muscle memory overriding conscious control. That instant of distraction was all Yiska needed. He lunged forward, grabbing Voss's gun hand and twisting until bones cracked with sounds like breaking kindling. The derringer fired harmlessly into the tunnel ceiling, and Voss released Lavinia with a scream of pain that echoed off stone walls. The confrontation between them became savage and extended, pitting Voss's desperate cunning against Yiska's warrior training and frontier-hardened strength. They fought through rising water that was now shoulder-deep, each man trying to drown the other, while debris battered their bodies and limited oxygen made every breath precious and difficult to obtain. Yiska's shoulder wound had reopened blood, mixing with floodwater, to create pink foam around their struggle that spoke of serious injury and potential blood loss. Pain lanced through his arm with every movement, but he fought through it with grim determination, born of knowing Lavinia's life depended on his victory. Voss was stronger than his soft appearance suggested. His sedentary lifestyle, hiding wiry muscle and desperate cunning that came from years of surviving through manipulation and intimidation. He fought like a cornered rat, using every dirty trick he knew, eye-gouging groin, strikes, attempts to use floating debris as weapons to crush or stun his opponent. A broken pickaxe handle nearly knocked Yiska unconscious when Voss swung it at his head with enough force to crack skull. The Cheyenne warrior ducked at the last second, the weapon grazing his scalp and opening a gash that sent blood streaming into his eyes, blinding him and making accurate movement nearly impossible. Blinded and disoriented, he swung wildly and missed, giving Voss another opportunity to attack with renewed fury. The businessman drove his knee toward Yiska's solar plexus, but the warrior twisted away and countered with an elbow strike that caught Voss in the ribs with enough force to crack bone and drive air from his lungs. Both men were gasping now, their strength failing as the cold water sapped their energy, and the lack of breathable air made their lungs burn with each labored breath. Voss pulled his hidden knife and slashed at Yiska's throat, the blade missing by inches and opening a red line across his collarbone instead. Blood poured from the wound, and Yiska's vision began to blur as blood loss and oxygen deprivation combined to weaken his responses and cloud his judgment. But the warrior had one advantage. He had learned to fight through pain and exhaustion during years of raids against enemy tribes, battles where defeat meant death, not just for himself, but for his entire band. Drawing on reserves of strength, he didn't know he possessed strength that came from generations of Cheyenne warriors who had never surrendered. Yiska managed to get behind Voss and apply the chokehold he'd learned fighting Crow warriors in his youth. Voss struggled frantically, his fingernails clawing at Yiska's arms and drawing blood. But the warrior held firm with the determination of someone who understood that some battles could not be lost. The businessman's movements grew weaker, his struggles more feeble, until finally he went limp in Yiska's arms, consciousness fleeing as oxygen stopped reaching his brain. But there was no time to savor victory, or even confirm that Voss was truly incapacitated. The water had risen to their necks, and they could hear the ominous rumbling of more floodwater rushing through the upper tunnels with the roar of approaching destruction. In minutes, this entire section of the mine would be completely submerged, and anyone trapped here would drown, regardless of their victory over human enemies. The shaft! Yiska gasped to Lavinia, pointing toward a ladder barely visible above the waterline that led to higher levels of the mine. We have to reach the surface before the flood reaches the ceiling." Together, they fought their way through chest-deep water toward the mine shaft, the precious documents still clutched in Lavinia's arms, despite everything they had endured. Behind them, they could hear the roar of approaching floodwater that would soon fill every tunnel and passage with deadly efficiency, erasing all evidence of what had transpired in the depths. The third and final phase erupted at the canyon mouth, where Voss had installed massive gates that could divert the underground river through the mine workings with catastrophic results. The storm had swollen the river far beyond normal flow, turning what should have been controlled flood into raging torrent, carrying rocks, tree branches, and mining debris with crushing force that could destroy anything in its path. Shaw had recovered from Klein's drug, groggily making his way to surface with the doctor's help and growing assistance. Klein's conscience had finally overcome his fear for his daughter's safety, and he was now fighting alongside them against Voss's remaining forces, his medical bag forgotten, as he wielded a mining pick with desperate determination, born of accumulated guilt and need for redemption. The mining compound had become a battlefield where multiple conflicts played out simultaneously under the storm's violent orchestration. Hilda Price had arrived with several townspeople, including some of the dead miners, who had finally decided to stand openly against Voss's exploitation system rather than continue living as ghosts in their own community. Her shotgun roared twice in quick succession, and one of Pike's surviving men stumbled backward with buckshot in his chest, his weapon spinning away into darkness. But Pike himself was still alive, still dangerous, his wounded arm bound with strips of cloth, but his gun hand steady as ever, fueled by desperation and the kind of rage that came from seeing years of profitable work destroyed in a single night. The outlaw had positioned himself near the floodgates, cranking them open with mechanical precision, while his few remaining men held defensive positions around the mechanism. Rising water was already pouring into the mine entrance at devastating rate, and anyone still underground would be trapped within minutes by flood that would fill every tunnel and passage. "Close those gates!" Shaw shouted over the roar of rushing water, but Pike's men opened fire, forcing the lawman to take cover behind an overturned ore cart that provided minimal protection against concentrated gunfire. That's when Dr. Klein made his choice, the decision that would define the rest of his shortened life and determine whether his daughter would remember him as coward or hero. The mild-mannered physician who had spent his life healing rather than harming suddenly stood up from behind his cover, completely exposed to enemy fire, and began walking toward the floodgates with measured determination that spoke of absolute resolve. Pike saw him coming and raised his pistol, taking careful aim at the doctor's chest with the cold precision of someone who had killed many times before. "Stop right there, Sawbones, or I'll put a hole in you big enough to drive a wagon through." Klein never slowed his pace, never showed fear, though tears streamed down his face as he thought of his daughter Emma waiting for him in Denver, her 8-year-old innocence unable to comprehend the moral complexities that had driven her father to this moment. "My whole life I've taken an oath to do no harm," he said, his voice carrying clearly over the sound of rushing water and distant gunfire. "But sometimes, to save innocent lives, a man has to be willing to sacrifice his own. Sometimes the greatest healing requires the ultimate price." Pike's shot took Klein in the chest, spinning the doctor around and dropping him to his knees in the mud that was rapidly becoming a swamp of blood and rainwater. But Klein wasn't finished, wouldn't be finished until his final breath was expended in service to others. With his dying breath, he threw himself at the floodgate mechanism, his weight and momentum enough to jam the gears and stop the flow of water into the mine. "Emma," he whispered as his life ebbed away, blood mixing with rainwater beneath him. "Forgive me for not being there to protect you. But maybe this will keep other children safe from monsters like Voss." Shaw's shot took Pike through the heart a moment later, the outlaw's body pitching forward into the rising water, where it was immediately swept away by the relentless current that cared nothing for human ambitions or criminal schemes. The few remaining hired killers, seeing their leaders dead and their payment in doubt, chose discretion over continued resistance and melted away into the storm like shadows fleeing dawn. But Klein's sacrifice had come at the cost of his own life. The gentle doctor who had struggled so hard with the moral compromises forced upon him had found redemption in his final moments, choosing to save others even when it meant leaving his beloved daughter orphaned and alone in a world that showed little mercy to the vulnerable. As immediate violence subsided, survivors gathered in the muddy compound while rain continued falling and lightning illuminated the devastation they had wrought in their struggle for justice. The mine was permanently flooded, its tunnels filled with water and debris that would take months to clear, if clearing was even possible given the extent of structural damage. But they had achieved their primary objective. Voss was in custody, wounded and defeated but alive, to face territorial justice that would be swift and certain. Most importantly, the evidence they needed had survived the notebook, DeLuca's documents, and original ledgers from the mine office safe that detailed years of systematic fraud. Victory had come at considerable cost. Dr. Klein was dead, his heroic sacrifice saving countless lives, but leaving the community without its physician and his daughter without a father. Several other men had died in the fighting, and the mine's destruction had shattered Broken Wheel's economic foundation, along with the criminal enterprise that had supported it. The storm was passing clouds beginning to break apart, to reveal patches of star-scattered sky. But the real clearing would take much longer. Communities built on lies and exploitation could not be transformed overnight, and the work of rebuilding on foundations of honesty and mutual respect would require efforts from everyone who remained. In the darkness before dawn, with rain still falling softly and survivors tending wounded, Lavinia found herself alone with Yiska, beside Klein's covered body. Exhaustion and relief and grief had finally overwhelmed her reserves, and she began crying for everything they had lost and everything they had found, tears that washed away months of accumulated pain and fear. Without words, Yiska pulled her into his arms, despite his own wounds, and she buried her face against his chest, while sobs shook her slender frame. His embrace was gentle but strong, surrounding her with promise of protection and something deeper than mere alliance. The kind of love that was born from shared danger and mutual trust, tested by fire and flood, and proven stronger than any obstacle. "I thought I'd lost you in those tunnels," she whispered against his shirt, hands gripping fabric, as if afraid he might disappear like so many good things in her life. "You didn't lose me," he replied quietly, lips brushing her hair with tenderness that spoke of feelings too deep for casual expression. "And you won't. Not now, not ever. Not as long as breath remains in my body." She looked up at him, then seeing in his dark eyes reflection of her own feelings. Love born from shared danger and mutual trust, tested by fire and flood, and proven stronger than any obstacle that circumstances might place between them. When their lips met, it was with desperate hunger of two people who had faced death and chosen life, chosen each other, chosen hope over fear, despite everything they had experienced. The kiss was everything their earlier near misses had promised, tender and fierce, gentle and desperate, speaking of love and commitment that needed no words for confirmation. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, neither had any doubt about their future together or the challenges they would face as partners, rather than separate individuals struggling alone. The territorial courthouse in Broken Wheel, had never hosted proceedings like those that convened 1 week after the battle at Split Rock Canyon, Dakota Territory Mine. Judge Morrison had arrived ahead of schedule, summoned by urgent telegrams describing federal crimes that couldn't wait for normal circuit scheduling, bringing with him court reporters and legal clerks necessary for complex prosecution. Shaw presented the prosecution's case with methodical precision that revealed his legal training and understanding of territorial jurisprudence. The notebook DeLuca's copied records, original ledgers from Voss's personal safe, all revealing years of fraud on a scale that dwarfed anything previously seen in territorial courts and implicated numerous officials in what amounted to systematic criminal conspiracy. When Lavinia testified about her murdered husband, the revelation created the biggest sensation in the packed courtroom, with spectators murmuring and reporters scribbling frantically to capture every detail. Documents found in Voss's private papers revealed he had orchestrated James Reed's death 6 months before approaching Lavinia, eliminating an inconvenient husband to clear the way for forced marriage that would give him legal control over potential witness. He killed my husband not for money or business advantage, but to make me vulnerable enough to control. Lavinia said simply, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom with clarity that made every word audible. That's the kind of man we're dealing with, someone who murders innocent people as preliminary steps in larger schemes, who sees human lives as obstacles to be removed rather than sacred trusts to be protected. The testimony continued for 3 days, revealing a web of corruption that extended far beyond simple insurance fraud to include territorial officials, railroad executives, and federal contractors who had profited from Voss's systematic deception. By the time prosecution rested, it was clear that convictions would extend far beyond the primary defendant. When Judge Morrison announced the verdict guilty on all charges, a cheer erupted from the packed courtroom that could be heard throughout Broken Wheel and probably beyond. Voss was sentenced to 20 years in Yankton Jail, pending federal transfer to Fort Leavenworth, with additional time possible if federal prosecutors chose to file charges related to mail fraud and conspiracy against the government. But it was the revelation in the final evidence that provided the most shocking twist of all information that transformed the case from criminal prosecution to matter of territorial security. Among papers seized from Voss's private safe was detailed correspondence with hired killers outlining a plan to assassinate Peace Chief Running Elk Yiska's father, and blamed the attack on a rival Cheyenne band, creating a pretext for military intervention that would void existing treaties and open vast tracts of tribal land for mining development. The plan had been scheduled for implementation within weeks, meaning their actions had not only exposed massive fraud, but prevented genocide that would have triggered widespread Indian wars throughout the territory, conflicts that could have claimed thousands of lives and destabilized the entire region. "Your father needs to know," Shaw told Yiska as they reviewed the correspondence outside the courthouse. "These documents prove Voss was planning to murder him and use his death to justify military action against your people. The territorial governor needs to see this evidence as well. It changes the entire relationship between territorial authority and tribal sovereignty." That evening, as Broken Wheel celebrated justice, finally served with music and dancing in the streets, Yiska found Lavinia on the hotel's small balcony overlooking the main street. She wore a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes, her hair loose around her shoulders in a way that made his pulse quicken despite everything they'd been through together. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, as he joined her at the railing, her hands gripping the wood with nervous energy. "About what comes next for us." "I've been thinking the same thing," he replied, taking her hands in his and feeling the calluses that spoke of hard work and harder choices. "About riding north to tell my father what happened here, and about you coming with me to meet my people." "It won't be easy," she said, meeting his eyes directly. "I'm still a white woman in Cheyenne country, and some of your people will never trust me. will never accept that someone with my skin could understand or respect their ways. Some of my father's people, he corrected gently, but not all. You'll have me to speak for you, and actions to prove your worth. In Cheyenne tradition, what a person does matters more than what they look like or where they were born. That's all anyone can ask for the chance to prove themselves through deeds rather than words. She stepped closer, and he could smell sage and wildflowers in her hair. See starlight reflected in her green eyes that had seen so much darkness, but still held hope for better days ahead. There's something else. Something I've been afraid to say, because once said, it can't be taken back. Tell me. I love you. She whispered voice, barely audible above the evening breeze that carried sounds of celebration from the street below. I love you, Yiska. I love your courage and your honor, and the way you make me feel like I could be worthy of something better than just surviving from one day to the next. He cupped her face in his hands, thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones with reverence reserved for sacred things. I love you too, Lavinia Reed. Have since the night you chose to stay and fight rather than run and hide. You're braver than most warriors I've known, and wiser than many chiefs I've met. You have a warrior's heart, regardless of the color of skin that contains it. Their kiss sealed promises made and accepted commitment to a future built on a foundation of trust and mutual respect that no external force could shake. They would face opposition from her people, who would see betrayal from his people, who would see contamination. But they would face it together, and that made all the difference. Next morning dawned clear and cold with promise of snow in the high country, and certainty they would face whatever trials arose as partners rather than separate individuals struggling against impossible odds. Shaw came to see them off his new badge, catching morning sunlight, along with the satisfaction of a job well done and justice finally served. You're making the right choice. He told them both, his official manner softened by genuine affection for people who had proven themselves when testing came. This territory needs people who can build bridges between communities instead of walls, who can see past surface differences to common humanity beneath. As they rode out of Broken Wheel, heading north toward distant mountains and a shared future that would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine, Lavinia realized that the notebook tucked in her saddlebags was no longer the most important record of her experiences. The real documentation was written in the changes that had taken place within herself, the transformation from a powerless woman at the mercy of others' schemes to someone who could choose her own path and protect those she cared about. Behind them, the town settled into new rhythms of honest work and fair dealing, the kind of community that could be built when people chose cooperation over exploitation. The Voss affair had been a harsh teacher, but the lessons learned would serve Broken Wheel well in the years ahead. Trust, once broken, could be rebuilt if people were willing to work at restoration. Justice, though sometimes delayed, was worth fighting for regardless of personal cost. And love, when it found worthy recipients, could transcend any boundaries society might construct to keep people apart. 3 days later, they crested the final ridge before descending into the valley, where Yiska's people had made their winter camp, a sight that took Lavinia's breath away, with its beauty and organization. Smoke rose from dozens of lodges, arranged in the traditional circle that represented the sacred hoop of life. And she could see figures moving between the teepees, going about the daily tasks of survival and community that had sustained the Cheyenne for countless generations. The camp was larger than she had expected, housing perhaps 300 people who had chosen to remain in their traditional territory rather than accept removal to distant reservations. Children ran among the lodges, their laughter carrying on winter air, while women worked at tasks that seemed familiar despite cultural differences, preparing food, mending clothes, caring for families with the same dedication she had seen in every frontier community. Are you ready? Yiska asked, seeing nervousness in her posture despite her determination to see this through. "No," she said honestly, "but I'm ready to try, and sometimes that's all anyone can do." Peace Chief Running Elk met them at the edge of camp, a man in his 60s, whose weathered face bore the lines of wisdom earned through decades of leading his people through times of war and peace, feast and famine, hope and despair. His dark eyes studied Lavinia with careful attention, taking in everything from her travel-stained dress to the way she sat her horse with confidence born of hard experience rather than casual riding. When he spoke, it was in Cheyenne first words that carried the formal weight of someone making official pronouncement. Then he switched to English, his voice carrying accent, but perfect grammar that spoke of years spent learning the white man's tongue for purposes of diplomacy and survival. "Father," Yiska said, dismounting and approaching with respectful bearing, "this is Lavinia Reed. She is the woman who helped me prevent Voss from carrying out his plan to murder you and destroy our people through deception and betrayal." Running Elk's expression shifted as he absorbed the implications of his son's words, understanding beginning to replace curiosity as the full scope of what had been prevented became clear. "She saved my life." "She saved all our lives," Yiska replied. "And in doing so, she earned the right to choose her own path according to her own conscience. She has chosen to walk beside me if you will accept her into our family and community." The old chief studied Lavinia for a long moment that stretched like eternity, his experienced eyes reading character and intention, with accuracy born of decades spent evaluating people whose decisions could mean life or death for his people. Then he spoke in English, his voice carrying the formal weight of someone making an official pronouncement that would affect the entire community. "Any woman brave enough to stand against her own people to protect mine is welcome in our lodges. You will be daughter to me, sister to my people, and mother to future generations who will know peace because of your courage and sacrifice." He gestured toward the camp, where curious faces had gathered to watch the newcomers, their expressions ranging from welcoming to suspicious, but all showing the kind of intense interest that important events generated. "Come. There is much to discuss, and winter is no time for long conversations in the open air, where cold can freeze words before they reach understanding ears." As they rode into camp together, Lavinia felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her studying this white woman, who had somehow earned a place among them through actions rather than birth. There would be challenges ahead. She knew language barriers that would make communication difficult, cultural differences that could create misunderstandings, the simple daily work of proving herself worthy of the trust that had been given so generously. But beside her rode the man she loved, and ahead waited the opportunity to build something new from foundations of mutual respect and shared purpose, something that could serve as example for other communities struggling with similar divisions. Behind them lay justice served and evil defeated, while ahead stretched possibilities limited only by their courage to embrace them and their determination to make them real. Together, they rode toward a future that would test their love in ways they could not yet imagine, but would ultimately prove that some bonds are strong enough to bridge any divide that prejudice or circumstance might create between two hearts determined to beat as one. In the growing darkness of winter evening, with stars beginning to appear in the clear sky overhead, they carried with them the knowledge that love, when it was real and tested by adversity, could overcome any obstacle that human fears or social conventions might place in its path. The story of Yiska and Lavinia would be told around Cheyenne fires for generations to come, a reminder that courage and love could triumph over hatred and greed, that justice delayed was not necessarily justice denied, and that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships could achieve what seemed impossible when attempted alone. In Dakota territory, where the future was being written in blood and hope. They had added their own chapter to the great story of people learning to live together, despite their differences, choosing unity over division, love over fear, hope over despair. 5 years later, on a spring morning when the prairie grass stretched green and endless, toward horizons that no longer seemed to divide two worlds but unite them, Lavinia Running Elk, for she had taken her husband's family name in the Cheyenne, Way stood outside their cabin, watching their 3-year-old son chase butterflies through wildflowers that painted the meadow in colors too beautiful for any artist to capture. The boy was named James White Thunder, carrying the names of both grandfathers in the tradition that honored the past while embracing the future. His laughter rang across the valley like music, pure and joyful and innocent of the struggles that had brought his parents together. Marshal Shaw visited twice yearly, bringing news from the territorial capital and stories of other communities learning to build bridges instead of walls. Dr. Klein's daughter Emma, now 13, and under the care of her aunt in Denver, wrote letters that Lavinia answered with news of the growing mixed community that had formed around their home, a place where Cheyenne and white settlers worked together, learned from each other, and raised their children to see past surface differences to common humanity beneath. The notebooks that had started it all were preserved in the territorial archives, evidence of crimes that had been punished and wrongs that had been made right. But the real legacy wasn't written on paper. It lived in the community they had built, the love they had found, and the future they were creating for children who would inherit a world where cooperation was possible, where justice could prevail, and where love was strong enough to conquer any obstacle that fear or prejudice might place in its path. In Dakota Territory, where the future was still being written in hope and determination, Yiska and Lavinia had proven that some stories were worth telling, some battles were worth fighting, and some love was worth any sacrifice required to protect and preserve it for generations yet to come.